Have you ever wondered if we are truly alone in the universe? In this video, we will unveil terrifying experiences from people who believe they have seen something beyond our world. Hold on tight, because what you're about to hear might make you rethink everything you know about the unknown. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Let's move on to the first story.
Good evening, my name is Fernando, and I'm from a small town in the Midwest. I won't mention the town's name because I believe it could lead to future problems. In 1970, when I was 30 years old, I gathered two of my best friends, Jake and Mark, to spend a weekend fishing. It was April, and the night was warm. It was just the three of us on the boat. We had brought snacks, plenty of beer, a grill, of course, and fishing gear to enjoy the weekend away from the stress of everyday life. We left home on a Friday afternoon, took the boat, and headed upstream. We stopped at a well-known fishing spot. We arrived, cast our lines into the water, and started fishing. Everything was going great. We were reminiscing about the mischiefs we used to get up to when we were younger, laughing heartily with every memory. The night was warm, and the cold beer went perfectly with the freshly fried fish. Our night was going wonderfully. We had everything on that boat: drinks, food, friends, and good times. To be honest, it was one of the best nights of my life. Until around 2 a.m., we started hearing noises, the sounds of monkeys screaming in the forest. At first, we didn't pay much attention, as monkeys often act up when there's a predator nearby. However, the animal screams began to intensify and grow louder. That's when the commotion caught our attention. In the forest, a very bright light appeared. It was so intense that it hurt my eyes, and I couldn't see anything else. Within seconds, the light dimmed, and in the forest, a huge ball of energy appeared, about the size of an airplane. It left us very confused. The light ball ascended into the sky and disappeared among the clouds. I was completely bewildered. My two friends were stunned. We decided to stop fishing since it was already 2 a.m. We went inside the boat to sleep. We were quite disoriented. Shortly after, I remember waking up to Jake shouting at Mark to get inside the boat. Jake was shouting loudly, "Mark, for God's sake, what are you doing? Get in, Mark, for God's sake." And there was a loud noise coming from something above our boat. When I looked at Mark, he was bathed in a beam of light, and Jake wouldn't stop shouting. Jake then decided to pull Mark into the boat by his arm. Mark was like a statue, not uttering a word, with his eyes wide open and glazed. I was in a panic. I tried to start the boat, but to my surprise, the boat had no power. We were trapped there with something bizarre trying to get us. It seemed like that thing was trying to abduct Mark. That thing hovered above our boat for about 10 minutes, which felt like a year, until, out of nowhere, it left, and the boat started working again. We decided to leave immediately. Mark remained silent, not saying a word. When we got back to our town in the morning, with adrenaline still high, we went straight to the hospital. The doctor asked us what had happened to Mark, as he was in shock. We told the doctor everything, who was quite frightened and confused. We asked him not to tell anyone, but within a few days, the story was all over town. It became a major topic, with comments on every street corner. A month later, I received a visit from two very well-dressed men. They were wearing black suits with red ties and introduced themselves as federal government employees. What struck me as odd was their strong accent, making them seem like foreigners. They wanted to know everything, from the beginning to the end of the incident. I also found it strange that it was 11 p.m., and my two dogs hadn't barked, as they usually bark all night. I was quite intrigued by the visit. As soon as the men left, I rushed to check on my animals, and to my surprise, my two dogs were lying down as if they had been sedated. 2 days later, they mysteriously died. The next day, I went to Jake's and Mark's homes to inform them of what had happened. According to Jake, the same men showed up around 9 p.m. and asked him the same questions they had asked me. Mark's situation was different. The men never went to his house. According to Mark's wife, he had difficulty speaking due to the trauma from that fateful night. One thing I wondered was whether the men didn't go to Mark's house because they already knew he was completely speechless. Well, it was just a thought I had. Shortly after that, a few days passed, and my friend Mark passed away. It was a shock to all of us. Days after his death, the autopsy results came back, and to my surprise, Mark had an excess of radiation in his body. Again, the town was buzzing, but local authorities started covering up the cause of Mark's death. 2 weeks later, I began to notice unfamiliar people watching me near my home. Coincidentally or not, they looked similar to the men who questioned me, tall, white men in black suits and red ties. My previously peaceful nights were replaced with nightmares involving aliens. I asked my friend Jake if he was having similar dreams, and he said yes. That's when I became paranoid. I began watching the sky on clear nights, and to my surprise, I started seeing mysterious lights in the sky frequently. One morning, as I was leaving the house to buy bread, I saw two people hanging from a utility pole in front of my house, performing maintenance. I thought it was strange since I had never seen that company around before. Suspicious, I went to the city's electric utility company to find out if they had hired any subcontractors for maintenance. To my surprise, the electric company informed me that they hadn't hired any subcontractors. That news hit me hard psychologically. I was panicking, despite my attempts to stay calm. My wife was also very frightened by everything happening, as I kept filling her ears with my suspicions that we might be being monitored by strange people. One time, Jake's wife came to my house to see if he was with me. I told her no, that he wasn't here, and that I hadn't seen him. I mentioned that Jake was probably doing maintenance on the boat. She thanked me and said she would wait a bit longer to see if he would come home since he hadn't shown up for lunch. When night fell, Jake's wife returned to my house and informed me that he still hadn't arrived and that she was very worried about his absence. I was very concerned as well and started searching for him around our neighborhood. Nobody knew where he was. We searched hospitals, police stations, and the morgue, but there was no sign of my friend Jake. After 3 days, Jake's body was found in a forest 15 kilometers from his home. His body was found without eyes or tongue. I almost had a heart attack. I was devastated, as was my wife, upon hearing the news. Days after the incident, my wife's cousin, who works at the city morgue, came to my house. I was very shaken. It was still 7 p.m. My wife's cousin said, "I need to tell you something very serious. You won't believe it. I was the one who performed the autopsy on Jake. I want you to promise me that this conversation will never leave this room because if it leaks, I could be in trouble." My wife and I promised never to speak of it to anyone. Then, he told us that whoever did that horrible thing to Jake used some kind of laser, and the cuts were perfect, all cauterized. In other words, there was no blood. Whoever did that used a technique he had never seen before. To make matters worse, all of Jake's organs had been removed through his rectum. It was something I had never seen in my life. The technique was completely unknown to me, as was the equipment used to perform that atrocity. The worst part was Jake's facial expression. He had a heavy, terrified look, with his mouth open as if he had tried to scream for help. I'll confess, I have performed many autopsies, but Jake's deeply affected me. He looked terrible. It was something dreadful. The most sinister part was that two strange men appeared in the autopsy room to observe the entire procedure done on Jake's body. They introduced themselves as federal government agents and informed me that I should not talk to anyone about what I saw during the autopsy, as leaking details could lead to serious problems. After my wife's cousin told us everything, I must confess I was in shock. Fear paralyzed me, and when I looked at my wife, I realized she was also in shock from everything she had just heard. One thing was certain, at that moment, all I wanted was to disappear. After my wife's cousin left, we reached a conclusion. The next victim would be me. I would be the next to be targeted. So, we decided to flee our beloved town. We left everything behind. Today, I live in another state, where my wife and I are raising our children, trying to move on with our lives. My name is Vincent. I'm 33 years old, and I live in a big city. Today, I'm going to share an experience that happened with my girlfriend and me in 2021, and which, from that day on, changed my belief for the rest of my life. I've always enjoyed camping to be closer to nature. I love bathing in waterfalls, listening to the sound of birds, and I've always felt at peace in those places. Whenever I had the chance to spend a weekend away from the stress of the city, I wouldn't think twice. I'd pack my backpack and head off without a destination for another adventure. Whenever my parents found out that I was going camping, they would ask me to be careful, as the places I used to camp were quite remote from the city, and nowadays crime is at an all-time high everywhere. However, I didn't pay much attention to those warnings because, in my view, the places I liked to visit had virtually no crime, and I preferred to take the risk, as I loved being away from all the chaos of the big city. One time, I was talking with Richard, the manager of my store, and among various topics, a conversation about haunted places came up. Richard told me that he had grown up in the countryside and was used to hearing stories about strange and unexplainable things constantly told by his parents and grandparents. Stories that, for a city person like me, seemed almost fantastical. In fact, I had never been interested in those ghost stories. To me, when you die, everything ends. I was quite skeptical about such matters until, a few days later, I met Julia, who is now my girlfriend. At the time, we were getting to know each other better, and Julia was quite different from me. She believed in hauntings and life after death. Generally, she even believed in werewolves, which to me seemed crazy. According to her, this was because she had spent most of her life in the countryside. So, it was normal for her to believe in these things. In fact, she claimed to have witnessed some things herself. She actually reminded me of Richard with her talk about these subjects. That's when it struck me. Could all this be true? Is it possible that both Julia and Richard share this same kind of belief? I had camped in various places and had never seen anything unusual. Well, actually, I was so lost in thought that I didn't pay attention to the rest of the conversation with Julia. I remember that I kept thinking about that topic for the rest of the day. The next day, I asked Julia if she wanted to go camping with me. She didn't hesitate and accepted my invitation. We were going to a spot that seemed perfect for camping, in the middle of nature and near several waterfalls. I made plans for the following weekend. When Friday came, after lunch, I went home to pack my things for camping with Julia. Once I finished, I stopped by her place and we headed to our destination. The trip was smooth. We arrived at sunset and quickly set up our tent. It was very cold that day. Shortly after, we were chatting and enjoying some good wine inside the tent, with the sound of the waterfall a few meters away. After a few hours, we fell asleep. I remember waking up to the sound of some animals that seemed quite scared during the night, which intrigued me a bit. I shone the flashlight on Julia's face, and she was in a deep sleep. That's when I opened the tent to see what was going on, and as you might expect, there was nothing, literally nothing. The darkness was terrifying. I decided it was better to go back to sleep. It took me a while, but eventually I fell asleep. The next morning, I asked Julia if she had heard anything unusual. Julia said no, that she didn't even remember what time she fell asleep. However, she asked me what I had heard. I then told her about the noises of the animals running scared. Julia said it could have been some large predator or some spiritual entity, as many entities wander through the forest. I preferred to believe in the large predator hypothesis. We spent Saturday exploring some waterfalls. However, the waterfall Julia liked the most was called Seven Falls, which is indeed very beautiful. We also went to the town center to buy a few more things for our last night. I remember we arrived before dark. We did the same routine as the previous night, talked about everything, had some intimate moments, drank wine, and then went to sleep, until, suddenly, I woke up terrified by a scream of horror from Julia. When I realized she wasn't with me in the tent was completely open. I remember the immense fear that took over me. My spine froze. I grabbed the flashlight from my phone that was in my backpack, and when I stepped out of the tent, I saw something bizarre. Julia was frozen, like a statue, completely in shock. In front of her, some orbs of light started to appear, more than 5 orbs the size of our tent. These orbs were about 20 meters away. I was very confused by this. That's when the orbs began to disappear quickly. I grabbed Julia by the arm. She looked at me, completely scared, and started crying. We ran back to the tent and stayed awake for the rest of the night. By 5:30 in the morning, we packed up the tent, organized our stuff in the car, and drove back home. In the car, Julia, calmer, told me that she had woken up to a strange noise in the middle of the night. The noise was next to our tent, and she thought it sounded like a child. According to Julia, she opened the tent, shined her flashlight outside, and confirmed her suspicion. Yes, it was a child, and it was moving away from our tent, The child seemed lost. That's when Julia went towards the child and directed the flashlight at it. To her surprise, someone touched her on the back, and when she turned around and shined the flashlight, she saw a completely gray being with black eyes. It was a sort of human-like entity, but different. Julia screamed and ended up paralyzed in her legs and arms. I was very frightened by what happened after that day. I never had the courage to camp again. I began to believe that there is not just our life here on Earth. Today, I believe, in the worst way, that in addition to us, there are other inhabitants, and I can't say if they are spiritual or embodied beings wandering this Earth, where many mysteries still exist and no one knows how to explain them. This happened in Brazil. It was well past midnight when the taxi driver was heading home, driving through a nearly deserted avenue at that hour. He was a little over a kilometer away from a rural area filled with hills, including the famous Morro da Mariquina, known for its national reputation since the late 1970s when several people, including authorities, witnessed supernatural events. Upon seeing a colored light in the sky, the taxi driver stopped his car. He watched the light for a few minutes, thinking it might be an airplane. However, the light hovered in the air, unmoving. He then thought it could be a helicopter, but he didn't hear any engine sounds. When he checked the time, it was already 1 in the morning. Other drivers who had also seen the light began to park their vehicles, forming a line of about 10 cars. In 1979, traffic was not heavy in that area, and most people were already asleep at that hour. Soon after, drivers started getting out of their cars, forming a small group, silently watching as the light descended over the Morro da Mariquina. The next morning, comments began circulating among people in the plaza, security guards, taxi drivers, police officers, and rural residents. This is just one of many reports about that strange flying object. However, the appearance was not exclusive to the Morro da Mariquina. This location became more famous because it was where the sightings began, but throughout January 1979, other lights were also seen in the neighboring hills, in the neighborhood of Capitera, and in the neighborhood of the Morros. All these places are located near each other, on the border between the cities of Sorocaba and Votorantim, beside the Raposo Tavares Highway, between kilometers 95 and 97. At the beginning of that year, besides ufologists coming from various places, the region was invaded by caravans of curious people from other states and even neighboring countries. Everyone had the same goal, to verify if those lights were truly from an unidentified flying object. The influx of people increased significantly, attracting journalists from radio, TV, newspapers, and cameramen, all eager to capture any sighting they could believe was from another planet. There was a rumor that persisted for years. One night, during the appearance of a flying saucer over a quarry in the same region, the machine stopped when the power supply was interrupted. No one could start the quarry's generator, the vehicle engines turned off by themselves, and even the camera batteries discharged. Joel Machado, who lived in Sorocaba, in the Vila Hortensia neighborhood, was a neighbor of a man who, on one occasion, saw the lights of a supposed flying saucer while preparing to put his car in the garage. This sighting made him famous at the time, so much so that the press sought him out and published his story in a prominent city newspaper. This made him even more sought after by curious people looking for details about the subject. The Morro da Mariquina, which was already known, began to attract crowds, including street vendors. Sometimes, there were so many people that it even seemed like an event, with hot dog vendors and other snacks. The lights did not always appear in the same place, changing position every night, which meant people had to move from one side of the hill to the other, hoping to witness the phenomenon. In schools, children began to talk a lot about flying saucers, and with the help of drawings, they started to imagine the appearance of the object. Not everyone knew what those lights meant, but many claimed to have seen the light descend from the sky and then return to where it had come from. For residents who set up camps around the farms, the arrival of the curious was an opportunity to increase their earnings, selling sandwiches, barbecue skewers, and drinks. A curious fact is that in Votorantim, 2 men who also saw the flying saucer became so popular that they were elected to the city's legislative body. However, one of the most well-known residents of Votorantim, was not a politician, but became famous for his work in the development of the municipality and for having experienced an extraterrestrial phenomenon. He was known as Tomazinho, the man of the flying saucer. In 2017, he was honored by the city council for his contribution to the city's growth. During the session, a councilor referred to him as the man who saw the flying saucer, moving all those present. Many people made assumptions, saying that perhaps it was a foreign government that, using flying machines, came to spy on the hills, where there was supposedly some mineral of interest. Others said there might be gold in that place and that the government was interested in its exploitation. For a while, some men appeared with metal detectors, assessing what might be hidden underground. Their true goal was to discover if there was gold there. They visited landowners, asking for permission to conduct research on the land. However, it was never known if they actually found gold. To this day, in a preserved forest area, there are marks of excavations made in an attempt to find precious material. Some residents of the region firmly believe that all the effort of the so-called gold miners was in vain, as they found nothing of what they expected. In edition number 21363 of the Jornal Cruzeiro do Sol, from Sorocaba, São Paulo, dated January 9, 1979, an article titled "Flying Object Mobilized Even the Police" was published. The newspaper reported the story of a resident who, after seeing a flying object, contacted the police to report the incident. Initially, the police thought it was a hoax, but, due to the man's insistence, a patrol car was sent to the location around 3 in the morning. The police drove along Coronel Nogueira Padilla Avenue, heading to the neighborhood, and upon arriving at the site of an old supermarket, also saw the mysterious lights hovering over the place. According to the interview given to the Jornal Cruzeiro do Sol, the police said they tried to communicate with the object using the patrol car's spotlight, and the UFO responded with its lights, which became brighter and then dimmer, almost going out. Later, the light moved to the end of the avenue, stopping again for a short period over a beverage factory, and then continued toward the hills, where a quarry was located. The flying object stayed there until dawn. The police remained on high alert, with all the patrol cars from Sorocaba on site, and another patrol car arrived from the neighboring city. In total, about 20 officers were present, all witnessing that UFO with many colorful lights. There seemed to be several small, bright objects forming a circle, with the largest and most radiant at the center. At dawn, the flying object was still visible in the sky. By 6 in the morning, the stars were beginning to fade, but the flying saucer remained visible until sunrise.
Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any new and terrifying videos.